So I think more or less we've acquiesced. Oh no, we got a few more, but it's okay. While they're getting some chow, we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome to this Pacific New STEM workshop, focusing on providing industry and R&D experiences over to all of you, the masters, PhDs, and postdocs here at Brown in the Science, Technology, Engineering, and Math, or specifically those who are within the School of Engineering. My name is Mauro Rodriguez. I am an assistant professor of engineering here in the School of Engineering, focusing on fluid and thermal sciences, specifically computational fluid dynamics. And today, we have a great and wonderful panel. I'm going to quickly introduce them, and then I'm going to pass it over to, and also introduce the facilitator, and then pass over the mic to the facilitator. So from left to right, we have Joe Bush, who did his PhD in chemistry, and he's the Director of Battery Insights at Analog Devices. We have Sean Flannery, PhD in biomedical engineering. He's a data scientist in the ultrasound monitoring group at Philips. And then we have Janet Toyjanova, who did her PhD in mechanics of solids, and she's the Associate Director of Translating Energy at Vertex Pharmaceuticals. And then here to my left, now to my left is Su-Xing Lin, who is the Assistant Director of Career Counseling and Graduate Services in the Career Lab here at Brown. And so with that, passed over the mic to Lin to welcome our wonderful panel and to take it off with the questions.
Thank you, Mauro. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Zhichun Lin. I'm the Assistant Director of Career Counseling for graduate students, especially PhD students at Brown. My office recently changed the name from Career Lab to Brown Center for Career Explorations. So I mainly work with PhD students who wants to explore diverse career options, especially in industries. So today we are very happy to have our three great PhD alumni who are currently working in different industry and talk about the research and especially how to prepare for industrial R&D, the interviews. So this panel will have three parts. The first part will be, we will ask three questions to the speakers and they will talk about that. And the second part will be for you to ask any question you want to the speakers. And the last part is feel free to talk any of the speakers for networkings. So without further ado, so let's start. So first, I have three questions to ask the speakers. So first, could you share with us about your career transition from academia to industry?
I guess should I take it off down here? Sure. So my transition was a little bit, you could say it was a little circuitous, but at the same time it was intentional. And so I did my PhD in the chemistry department doing physical chemistry with Professor Weber. And I then when looking at postdocs, I had a choice between two postdocs and chose a little bit more of an entrepreneurial postdoc as opposed to a more academic postdoc, where I was sort of building a new device from the ground up. And so that I found very appealing, where I knew I wanted to go into industry, and that was more entrepreneurial, so to speak. From there, after I did that for 3 years and went from sort of a drawing on a napkin to having a device where we had sort of initial proof of concept data on it, but I got to a point where I knew it was going to be a whole nother sort of Herculean effort after 3 years to take it to the next level. And so the time to transition became apparent. At that point, I was kind of burning out of academic research for a while, and a friend of mine who had gone down to New York City recruited me to come and join him in co-directing an academic center at the Bronx Community College on sustainable energy. And that really spoke to me about being able to have impact in people's lives today. So working at a community college, trying to make an impact on the students there, especially in a place like the Bronx. So there, I spent a couple of years. I built a curriculum around life cycle assessment, and that was the first sustainability curriculum on the books there. But then also leading some projects with Arduinos and kids making environmental sensors. And so that was really impactful for me, where kids were, you could hand them an Arduino and it's like, take it home, see what you can do tonight. And they were really blown away, like, I can touch it. It's like, yeah, take it home, do something, right? So that was really really amazing. During that time, I did the NSF I-Corps program. That person I was co-directing with had some IP from a national lab. And so he was the academic lead and I was the entrepreneurial lead. And so that was my first boot camp for sort of business development. And so doing those 100 interviews and the business model canvas, which I hear you guys have heard about, that sort of got that entrepreneurial bug in me there. Um, we went through that program, and at the end came to sort of the go no go decision, and based on a variety of factors, we chose not to pursue that. There was also family life transitions happening where New York City wasn't really cutting it. I had just been taken off in the job at the Bronx, and my wife was like, New York City's not really cutting it for us. So that was a very difficult transition where I had just started getting sort of job satisfaction and recognition on the campus, and I had to make a choice to transition out. So that was very difficult. At that point in time, I sort of reached out to my network back up north towards family in this area in Massachusetts. And a friend of mine who worked at the Mass Clean Energy Center was like, hey, there's this nonprofit in Worcester that really could use some help. They're trying to build a startup incubator ecosystem for startups in Central Mass. And so I went and I took over that position where it was like an office in literally like a one-room office with a file cabinet and an intern on Clark University campus. And over 3 years, people thought I was crazy, but we went into this warehouse that was like covered in graffiti, and we cleaned it out and renovated it. We got some startups and some investors to come and give talks, free software. They started a little incubator there. Did that for 3 years. Got really engaged in the WPI alumni network, they had the Tech Advisor Network, they call it. So this really great community of alumni who would come back and give free mentoring advice, similar to like sort of lean canvas type, work with the startups there. And so during that period, I was giving a lot of time there. I was running a nonprofit where my explicit job was to help other people. And I'll say that's a really great way to find opportunities, is when you are giving help. Over the course of doing that, I got to know one of the startups that was like the most promising startup of the ecosystem there. And they have at one point offered to say, oh, can you put this job posting on the incubator website? And as that opportunity, running that incubator had sort of plateaued, where there was like on a fundraising front, it sort of got to about as far as I thought that I could reasonably take it. One of my mentors said, sort of pointed out, there's a time where it's a great building story, but if you see the fall coming or a plateau coming, there's maybe a time, one of my mentors told me that maybe I should look at a transition, that it was a good time. I said, you're probably right. And so I applied for that job with one of the startups, and so I got it. I was the first business development person at a small startup coming out of WPI, a spin-out, I-Core type stuff. They did I-Core also. And I was employee 7 at a startup where we were in a Quonset hut, which is like a airplane hangar type garage, grinding up batteries and dissolving them in sulfuric acid and creating new battery materials there. So I stuck with that till about employee 35. They were fundraising again, and there was some various, as the first business development person, it got time to like scale up the sales team, and it was doing like commodity waste contracts at that point. The opportunity came up to where there was a job posting at Analog Devices. They're looking for a battery expert. And during those 3 years where I was working with OEMs like vehicle companies and consumer electronics companies, talking about their recycling programs, setting up recycling programs, and also working with cell manufacturers to qualify new battery materials with them. So I got to know pretty well the battery ecosystem over that period. And then I ended up going to Analog. It was an opportunity where I could bring together the instrumentation stuff that I had been doing back with Peter Weber, and the battery stuff, which is really kind of inspiring to me. And yeah, now I've been there just over 2 years now. So that's my transition story.
All right, so I think I'm probably the most recent graduate on this panel. I graduated last year from the biomedical engineering department. My research at the time was on quantitative MRI for orthopedic applications, and now I'm working on ultrasound for obstetrics, so it's a bit of a switch, but still in the medical imaging domain. But basically, I defended in March last year, and then after that, I really went full-time into the job search process. I had at that point narrowed down what my, preferred requirements for a company would be. So I knew I wanted to look in the Northeast and the West Coast and cities in particular. I knew I wanted to work in a data scientist or deep learning type role at a medical imaging or medical device company. And I had a general sense from my fellow lab alumni who went through the same process, what to expect during that process, what to ask for in terms of like company culture and work-life balance and things like that. But I found it really helpful to have lots of informational interviews with folks in my network, whether they were lab alumni, friends of friends, friends of friends of friends, just really going down that list of like strong and weak ties, and just asking them what their experience was like, and not necessarily pursuing that like in looking for a referral or anything like that, just to understand what their experience was, what they do in their day to day, and figure out if that role would be something I would be interested in, or that company, if it's an interesting project, interesting field of work, and a good culture to be in. And so through that, I ended up reaching out cold to a former undergrad TA of mine, and he was working at Philips, and initially didn't go anywhere, but we chatted, we kept in touch, went back and forth a little bit, and eventually, out of the blue, one day he connected me to who's now my current boss. Just said like, hey, like I was talking to Jonathan the other day, he'd like to talk to you, do you have a few minutes tomorrow? And so I quickly gathered my notes and set that meeting and got to learn a little bit about the project that I'm now working on. And I think like it fit everything I was looking for pretty closely. It seemed like a fun project to work on. The team environment seemed to be constructive, so there were opportunities for mentorship, both to give and receive mentorship, and also I think room for career growth, skill growth, and to really be a contributor to the project at hand. It was in Boston, which was great for me. That's one of the places I wanted to end up. Yeah, and I think we'll probably talk more about the interview process and the job talk process later on. So maybe I'll just pause there and hand it off to you.
All right, so my turn. I graduated with a solid mechanics degree in 2014. And then, so I was actually the first student. It was two of us for our professor. So my professor or advisor was pretty new. So I got a very interesting experience, which I'm very thankful for. I got to build a lab. I got to explore a lot of different projects. Not all projects worked, but the amount of skills that I got at the end was just obnoxious. Just because when you have a new professor, you don't have a grant yet. You have to continue exploring and exploring and exploring and submitting documentation for grants. So when I got close to graduation, I knew, so I was working with a hospital, with the Rhode Island Hospital on my dissertation topic, and I knew that I wanted to be closer to the end user, so closer to the patients. So my only condition was that I had to work on medical devices and work on product development medical devices as close to the patient as possible. I'm also an international student, so it created a lot of issues finding a job. I applied for, I think, 70 positions. I'm not lying. It was like every night I would come home, finish my experiments, and I would just start applying. And so actually the job that I did get, I got few interviews, I got few job offers. The job that I did take was from career fair. So I went to career fair at Brown, I think November 5th is this year, so November 4th. And that's the job that I got. I just connected with a person networking. The company was Zamedica. It's a product development company in Providence. And I worked as a research and development engineer for them for 8 years. One thing I would note, it is a consulting company. So anytime you work for a consulting company, it's never a 40-hour week. It's still pretty close to your PhD schedule. The minimum is 45 hours because it is a billable work and you have very strict deadlines. And I loved it. Again, it was kind of a boot camp similar to my PhD. But then personal life happened and I had a baby, so I had to transition to something that has reasonable schedule. So that's when I went to a bigger corporation. So I worked for Waters for a while, more in a management position. I it was a good experience. It was a great company, but I did not like management. I do like more hands-on work. So then I went to Vertex as a translational engineer, and so my work right now is basically taking what our advanced research is working on. They're working on amazing new innovations, not all of them getting commercialized. So my job is to make sure when we do have proof of concept is how do we create the full package? Does it have a design for manufacturing? Did we run all the tests? Did we de-risk everything? Do we need to run any preclinical trials or anything else to pretty much put a proposal together for our manufacturing team to be like, hey, this is ready to be commercialized? Because obviously, as you all may know, if you're doing research, not every project makes it. Actually, a lot of projects fail. So that's my job, to make projects that do not fail see the light.
Yeah, thank you for sharing such interesting stories. So, based on the stories we heard, perhaps you already getting, it's like two things. First, things is you need to get informations from various people, then learn you what you like, what are available for you. The second thing is never stop trying something new. Even you don't know now, but you don't know whether you will like them in the future. So, trying something new, that's very inspiring. Thank you. So second question is, now let's get back to R&D. So when discussing the term research in R&D, what are the differences between conducting research in R&D, research and development in industry, and conducting research in academia?
Okay, I'll go first. So as a research and development engineer for 8 years, the big difference that I learned compared to my PhD, this project is not yours, because during PhD you have a lot of failed experiments. That I think Kim told me once that there is a success rate of 1%. You write a dissertation based on 1% success. Everything else usually fails. That's not true in industry, because again, the more failure you have, the more money the company loses. So you have to be pretty quick in making decisions whether it's going to be successful or not. You have to use a lot more data, you have to be able to be agile, and you have to be able to walk away from research if you need to. Another thing to note that when you build, I'm an experimentalist myself, so when you build an experimental setup or when you work on a product, if it takes you 10 hours to glue something together and get the experiment to work only with like perfect weather and stars, most likely it's not commercialized. So that's another thing you have to remember. You have to think about scalability when you work on research. So every time you work on something, like, is it scalable? How many patients will it be prepared for? That means that perhaps what works on the bench will not actually be what's the final design is. So you have to start thinking, informing that.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And maybe, yeah, to add my own observations too, I think the resources available to you in industry, in my experience, have been significantly greater than what I had in academia. And just to give maybe one example of that, when I first started, I had to create a medical imaging phantom, which is just like a dummy basically that you scan on. In the academic environment, it might have taken 6 months to jury rig my own and then fine tune it and get it up and going. But in industry, I found one online and got approval to buy it in 5 minutes, and then we just had to wait for the shipping time, and then we're good to go. And then maybe another resource that I don't want to overlook too is just the knowledge and experience of everyone around you. You're in a team environment. You're in a broader department if you're in a larger company. And chances are, if you're running an experiment, there's someone who's done something similar before or used similar technology, and they're there to help you. So having that collaboration and support goes a long way, I think, too. And maybe, I think you kind of touched on this as well, the objective function is a bit different, where you're dealing not just with what is like are we contributing something novel to the field? Now we're thinking about other priorities as well. What is our timeline? What is the risk from a technical perspective, from a stakeholder adoption perspective, from a social perspective? If you're putting something out there in the world, what might the impact be? And so you have to take all those things into account when you're prioritizing what features you include in your minimum viable product, what might be nice to have at a later time point, and what should we put in the backlog for a later date to maybe address as things develop.
All great comments that from the other panelists here. I think to highlight two things, I would say interconnectivity and context. As was mentioned, it's not your project, right? You're supposed to own. You have to own one technical piece that you're working on that you have to have mastery of, but in the end, that's not yours. You have to hand that on to the next part of the team that's going to take it to the next step. I recently just had a conversation with someone on my team who's a more senior person of the sort of laboratory, operator, or like a lab engineer, and who should be, his next stages in advancement are moved towards the manager level, right? That's just the trajectory when you look at sort of job grades. And he's very conscious of wanting to move up and to get a promotion. And he was saying to me that, but I want to have one project that I can own, and that could be my project. And I was like, I'll be honest, that is in direct contrast to your stated ambitions to get a promotion, because you can only go so far in a company as an individual contributor. It's maybe, at some point you may graduate if you are, become a fellow or some really prestigious engineer that you could free up and not have any direct reports again. I've seen some people who are in the twilights of their careers that get that sort of free pass to be a roving sort of engineering consultant that get to pick their projects. That's sort of a rarity. So I guess that's something to think about, the interconnectivity, and that you're going to be working on pieces that have a much bigger impact there. And then the other side of that was the context, is that you need to make sure that you can understand what's really important for the overall project, so that you don't get just stuck in the weeds of what you're doing without keeping in mind the context of what documentation do you need to provide, how do you need to run your experiments, so that when it gets handed off to the next part of that, that next piece of connectivity, that you provided the right context that is going to make those handoffs more seamless.
Yeah, I think those are great tips. It sounds to me it's more like it's not just for do research for the sake of research, but you have to have more think about decision makings, and also why you're running this, what your goal is. So, and also the team environment. So with those mindset for doing research in industry, so my last question would be, what is the usual process for R&D job interview? Could you share some tips on how to prepare for that, especially the presentation, the job talk during the R&D interview?
So you're going to want to tell a story, right? It comes down to telling a story, and it's telling a story in a technical context. I think I saw in one of the questions whether or not to focus on a research project that may be more directly related to the application in the specific job, but what if that's not necessarily the chapter of your, the 1% of your research that you did that turned into your thesis, right? Where you maybe have a more complete story here, and you have some tangential skills you picked up along the way that make you maybe a little stretch for the job position, but still relevant. And I think that goes back to the context. You should tell the story where you have the best story, but you should be focusing on the tools that you've picked up along the way and the sort of universally translatable skills, right? Where it's like, I remember having a good friend in grad school. He was in the neuroscience department doing like brain research, and he got really tired of doing that type of research, and he wanted to move into industry. And he was so scared. I'm like, dude, you are the most brilliant person I know. And he's like, oh, I don't know if I have the right skills or whatever. He ended up taking like one of these, like a little boot camp for data science. And in the end, all it was teaching him the buzzwords that were the right way to describe the tools that he was doing on data analysis and handling huge data sets. And, so keep looking at your research, and even if it's a slightly off topic, keeping in mind what are the key things that the hiring manager is going to be looking for, is what are the skills that you have in terms of, like, I can do this feature extraction, I know how to quantitatively analyze this data, this is the relevant feature set that we were looking for that has some impact. I was able to extract this and I run some analysis, and this is why I can make this impact. So if you go through your main talk in that with that sort of a focus on the skills and value you can create by applying these technical processes, that's sort of universally applicable. Um, and then it doesn't hurt to have a little to tie things over to make sure they know it's like, oh yeah, and I know how to use that machine and I can do the same on the relevant stuff there. But it's really the story and the skills and showing that you have the ability to run through that analytical process flow.
Yeah, definitely agree with all of that as well. And definitely there's a lot of buzzwords and acronyms to catch up on as you go through the interview process and enter the industry environment. In my experience, I think there were maybe two entry points into the interview process. In some cases, after an application, I would get a call from HR for a phone screen, and that would be a basic, just like checking off all the boxes on your resume, make sure they line up with what you said, and that like you are who you said you are. And then you would proceed into the main interview process. In other cases, like I mentioned before, when I was referred through my network to my current hiring manager, my current boss, I would start with an intro call to that team leader who was hiring, and just get to know them and the project that they're looking to hire for, what the skill set might be, and then segue into the later interviews if it moved forward. And so from there would generally be several rounds of technical and behavioral interviews. The details of that would really vary based on what kind of company you're applying to. In some cases, these would all be on a single day, and they would be very code-oriented, have you do whiteboarding a function in front of them. In other cases, it might be more high-level, just thinking through why does this regularization technique work, something like that. And then usually after that, there would be the job talk. And that, it would again vary from company to company, but generally you'd have like an hour time slot, give or take, including the question and answer period. And usually it was left up to me whether or not I wanted to save the questions for the end or have them throughout the presentation. My personal preference was to make it more of a conversation, so if people had questions, just like they could chime in on any slide, and that helped me relax a little bit because it was a little more informal. And as far as content, I usually used a condensed version of my thesis that fit that time constraint and allowed plenty of time for questions. And at that point, having gone through a lot of the technical hurdles, I wanted to really focus on my methodology, showing like how I thought about the problems. Maybe as I go through the methods, talking about why I decided against one approach and landed on the approach that I chose in the end, and going through that risk mitigation framework for each step of that process. One piece of feedback I got at a later point from my now coworker was that the visualizations that I used and that other people had used in successful presentations were a good point of differentiation, because you can really communicate a lot just by having good visuals, both to a technical audience, but that can be calibrated up or down depending on who you're talking to, whether that's more of a business audience or a clinical audience or whatever audience you might be facing there. And yeah, I think that's it. So.
Right. So for when you're applying for consulting company, usually at the beginning you get a test actually. So the screening, same thing happens. The hiring manager would screen you, make sure your resume is great, is correct and accurate, but then you would get a technical test before you even getting invited to the job talk. Large corporations usually don't do this test. Consulting companies do those tests because they need to make sure that you have the skills that they're looking for. For the job talk itself, I'll start with the resume. It's very important to have a good resume, and it can't be general. You wouldn't be able to apply with the same resume to all jobs. You do need to read the job description. If the job description is not available, if HR is reaching out to you, I would ask for a job description and make sure your resume highlights what the job description is talking about. If you're applying on LinkedIn or anywhere online, they actually use AI to screen through resumes. So that's the first screen. So if your keywords in your resume do not match what job description is looking for, then your resume might never even hit that first filter. So that's just one of the tips. Once you get to the interview, now it's your time to shine. Actually, once you getting to the interview, I think it's the hardest part, at least for me. It's your time to shine. How you present yourself, do your homework, like all of those things. It's not just words. You like would you pay attention, because now I'm interviewing other people and I know how we discuss the candidates, how you present yourself, how you understand the job description, how much homework have you done about the company. Make sure you understand what they're working on, whether it's a molecular assay or some drug or combination product or anything else, a medical device or ultrasound. You do need to know that. You can't just not do homework. Also prepare questions from yourself. Don't, if they ask you, hey, do you have any questions, always have some 2-3 ready to go. For the job talk itself, so my approach was, as I said, I had a lot of skills. So I was trying to highlight my skills, and actually the publications that I had, they did not highlight my skills as well as all the failed experiments that I had. And so I had to tell a story through that perspective. So I spent my presentation, a job talk, into experimental methods and cell mechanics. And I talked about how in cell mechanics, everything is tiny. This is the skills that I had to develop. This is the experimental techniques I had to develop. This is the data analysis things I had to do. The imaging modalities I had to learn. So kind of by telling the story, I also highlighted a few examples and showed proof what skills I do have, what I can bring to the table. Because my dissertation was about neutrophils. I never touched neutrophils in my life, but every skill I learned during PhD, I actually applied it at my work. So that was great. It doesn't happen to a lot of PhDs, so I feel like that was a unique experience for me. Another big thing is know why you're presenting something and make sure that you explain to people who you present to why you have done something. Because that's kind of the big thing throughout your career in the future, and they do need to understand that you understand your own justifications for your work. The reason for this is because sometimes you work on this pump that is the fastest, the greatest, the most efficient, it's just the greatest thing ever. No one has this pump, but you can't answer who at the end will use this. You don't know whether water and waste industry needs a pump this fast. They already have enough pumps. Maybe they don't ever will use something that's efficient. You don't know whether the liquid chromatography system will use this pump because maybe they already have a pump that meets their cost targets, and making it just a little bit faster will not really get them any more customers. So always think about why you're working on something. It can be the most novel thing ever, but if there is no customer at the end, in the same case in your experiments, if you don't understand why you're working on something, it would be really tough to explain to who you're presenting to. And one other thing, follow up, because you may think not everyone gets PhDs, but actually there's a lot of candidates for one position. You do need to differentiate yourself, and those little things where you do homework before the job talk, you follow up after, you ask questions, those smile, stay confident, show some soft skills, those things really do differentiate you and give more trust to the people who interview you.
Thank you. So now I think it's a time to open up a question from the audience. So you can ask any questions to the speakers you like. I'm gonna pass around the microphone.
Yeah, thanks for coming. Thanks for all your advice. I guess you answered a little bit of this already, especially you. But what are some common mistakes that you think people tend to make with this process, and what should they do differently?
All right. I think now being the employer and interviewing people, I think the most common mistake I've seen, one of them is really not a big mistake, but I did learn that everyone pays attention to this, not looking good for the interview, not dressing up, suit up. So that would be my. If you don't know whether the company is casual or not, they do pay attention to that. And then during job talk, again, all of us, at least I was, you so attached to your dissertation and the work you have done. You want to explain every little detail because probably that detail you spend the longest time on. Don't do that. No, like try to go back to the bigger picture. What are you applying for? What skills do you think you can offer to this company? Because if you explain Navier-Stokes equations and how you solved it 20 different ways or didn't solve it in 20 different ways, it's not going to help them. They already probably know that you have the background that you need to have. Another thing, I'll add to the job talk and also mistake. They will look in the way you explain very complex problem in simple words. So try to use that. Like imagine that imagine you teaching a class.
Thanks. Yeah, maybe I'll just add one thing. Going back to the informational interview process, I found it very helpful to approach those informational interviews just as an opportunity to learn about someone's experience and not as if I'm trying to get something from them, like trying to get a reference. I found now being on the other side that can come across as somewhat off-putting if someone like in their opening message who I haven't met before, it's like, hey, can you refer me? Can we talk about it? And so on. So it's helpful just like go into it, like ask them what their experience has been like at the company, in their role, what they like, what they don't like, what the transition was like for them. And sometimes they'll offer to refer you right there anyways without you having to ask. Sometimes you can like just send a thank you afterwards, and if something pops up at that company, you can follow up with them in the future and ask, hey, like based on our conversation, do you think this might be a good fit for me? Would you be willing to refer me? That can happen too. And sometimes people would say, hey, like maybe this position isn't a great fit for you, but I know someone who I think you'd really enjoy talking to, and they can maybe offer you additional insight, and then they connect you to that person, and then your network has just grown by one people or more, and maybe they can help refer you to a position at their company or to another person. And in one case, I ended up getting an offer from a startup in Vienna by like a fourth degree connection, where like I met one person who referred me to another person who referred me to another person, and eventually talked to this company. So yeah.
Yeah, great panel. It's hard to follow. It's hard to follow up because great advice here. I'll point out, I don't think I've ever gotten a job that wasn't through some connection, that there wasn't some, that through a network somehow that I was connected to it. And so I definitely, and if somebody at the company says, oh, it doesn't work now, and they point you somewhere, they're not pointing you to a dead end necessarily. You need to follow up with those things and to make sure you don't have that sort of sense of desperation in there. There's a sort of saying in the startup space, if you want investment, you ask for advice. If you want advice, you ask for investment, right? If you come and say, hey, can you refer me to this job? It's like, well, who the heck are you? It's like versus, hey, can you tell me about your company? And I'd love to learn more. And there's some interest, you guys are doing interesting stuff, right? That's a much better lead in. In terms of, what I've seen go, like in terms of things not to do when giving a presentation, I think you were alluding to it before. It's losing sight of the context when you're showing a slide. So in your interview, the thing that's on sale is you, right? And you need to remember the context for which the buyer is looking at the product that's on display right now. And when you're whatever slide you're putting on the screen, you better know why you're showing that slide. And it's not to, there may be some aspect of it is to show, yes, I calculated the right value to the, ninth decimal place. But is that what the person who's buying cares about? Right? If someone's shopping for a Corvette, do I need to talk to them about, the specs of the Corvette? Or do you take them for a test drive and you're like, isn't that, So like keeping in mind what's the message from the slide? Because if you get lost in honing in on the technical details and the people in the interview listening don't care about the technical details, but they want to understand your approach to solving the problem, yes, you should have gotten the right answer, but they're going to, that's sort of like a baseline. But understanding the different approaches that went into it, why you chose that approach, and what value or what insight you can extract from it. That's sort of the context that they're looking for, right? They want to see that you can connect your work to the larger picture, and so make sure you don't get lost explaining the weeds and not looking up and getting the feedback from the room of what do you care about hearing, and is this of interest. So.
Thank you so much to all the panelists. This was really helpful. As for the job talk, in academia, especially in dissertation, it's acceptable to say, like, I don't, like when there are questions, it's acceptable to say, I don't know, but this is what we know and this is how we could solve it. So how is questions in R&D interviews and specifically in job talks responding to, like, not really knowing the answer, but answering questions, I guess?
I think you hit on it in your question there, right? If you don't know the answer, don't bullshit and like try to make something up if you're wrong. But to tie it, it's not I also wouldn't leave it, I don't know. Right? Think through the thought process and the context, or say, that's interesting. You want to dig into that and show, it's again like, if I don't know how to solve the problem, what's my approach to solving the problem? That sort of a thing. I don't know.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Maybe like a few approaches that I found that have worked for me when I feel like I'm stumped by a question. Like repeating the question back slowly to them and like asking, is that right? Is that what you're asking? Can be helpful. Also, maybe kicking the tires on some of the assumptions, just to make sure you understand what it is they're asking a little bit, and that gives you time to think about how you want to respond as well. Am I addressing your question now? Okay.
Yeah, I think so. And I think I have more questions about the nature of the questions that you'll be asked. Is it mostly about the work that you presented on, or what you've worked on in the past, or what kind of questions do you get asked in the interviews?
Yeah, maybe I'll start with the job talk. A lot of the questions that I got during the job talk were along the lines of, like, what would you have done, like, if this didn't work? Or did you try, like, approach X, Y, or Z? Why or why not? So really trying to understand what, like, my thought process was in arriving at the final method that was used in the research being shared. I think that was very common. The risk mitigation framework that I think I mentioned before was, I think, a common way to approach things, where it'd be like, well, okay, what is the technical risk of doing this? What would you have done, like, if it didn't work out? How would you mitigate that downside risk there? So there's a lot oriented towards that. During the technical interviews, I think it's very, like, job and context dependent, but there was a lot more, like, digging into the weeds. If it's like an AI job, like making sure you understand the pros and cons of different types of models, different ways to prevent, like, over underfitting, like digging into those kind of weeds, making sure you understand what it is that you're doing there. And I think for, like, those kind of questions, if you know someone at the company, that's like a good opportunity to ask them, what was your experience like in the interview process, to help prepare for that.
Right. So I think from the questions perspective, both job talk or non-job talk, for a job talk, you get such a wide audience that you may get questions about anything you wouldn't even know. There may be a person who've done is exactly the same thing that you've done, and they get very nostalgic and they want to ask you about this more. Or some questions may be more softer and more about your process and, like, what is your decision-making process? What is your problem-solving process? Because everyone kind of has their approach, right? Like, everyone says, okay, this is my assumptions, this is what I know, this is what I don't know, this is what I may do. So I think you already answered the question on how to answer if you don't know something. Definitely don't pretend that you know something if you don't know something, but try to explain them how you would solve it. And then for the interviews themselves, at least in my experience, I'm not sure about you, people start staying away from very soft skill questions, like what would you do if you had a conflict at work? I haven't been asked that question since I was like many years ago. Now I think soft skills are coming from your interaction with the person that interviews you. And the question that I do ask is more about, okay, like what is your approach? How do you solve this? How do you solve that? If there is a situation where I don't know, you're working on a design problem that cannot be solved within the deadline that you have, what would you do? So they're interested, again, everything is time and money. So they're interested to see how you're either going to save and make them money or time, or how you would address a thing when there is a delay.
Thank
Also
you.
team.
Hi, I want to know, do you include the side projects in your job talk or any projects you've done before your PhD?
Yeah, I think that's probably very context dependent. So based on the job description that you're applying for, or even better, if you've had an opportunity to talk to the hiring manager or have your technical interviews already, based on what kind of questions they were asking, or what responses you get to your questions to them. You can ask the hiring manager directly what to expect, what are they looking for during that process, and then you can tailor what content you include in that presentation to that feedback, to the job description, and so on. So if you think that side project highlights some technical skills that might be relevant, or it took you, or you think the methodology you used, for example, like really gives you an opportunity to highlight your thought process, then maybe it's worth including. But yeah, I would say like at least make sure it's very fresh in your mind and that you can confidently talk about like every facet of that subject matter, from like ideation, hypothesis, methods, and the techniques you used, and so on, and the results.
I got a strategy that I've used in the past is it's always good to have an appendix, right? So you don't actually have to filter any of the stuff in terms of I can put all the slides there, and I have the main story I plan to tell, but I could have stuff in the backup. And I would say that if you want to introduce at the beginning, so if you're giving a job talk and a very technical, you prepared a very technical presentation, I don't think it hurts on your first slide to be like, this is me, welcome, just introduce myself. My name's Joe. I'm going to be talking to you about this, but just as like a brief summary, my experiences went from sort of A to Z and here, and today I'm going to focus and tell you the story about this project. But you could put in there sort of your, research table of contents and be like, this is chapter 1, whereas there's chapter 3 and 4 here also that, just so this is, there's other pages in the book here. So you could focus on the main story, but then if you catch someone's like, well, I don't give a crap about this, but I need people to work on this device, and did you use that there? That you plant the seeds in the audience to say, I'm going to talk about this, but you could ask me questions about all this stuff too. That way you can give your very focused, on-point technical talk on the message that's like, this is the best story I have, but you're essentially telling the audience that I have these other things that I can talk about. And so that way you can sort of have, it's a great way to seed the questions that you want to talk about.
The only thing I would add is sometimes when you work for a long time for a company and then you apply for another job, so like I'm not talking about the PhD, a lot of things you cannot disclose a lot of your projects. So in that case, I mean, I presented anything from hobbies to unsuccessful experiments to anything else, but as long as you can connect it into one story, like tell them a good story. If it's a hobby that you're talking about, it's great. If you add some sprinkle of research, some sprinkle of something else, it's also fine. You're selling yourself, you're selling your skills. So as long as your story highlights your skills, but at the same time also tells a story, you're good.
that's a good point. That if you have like the failed experiments or things that didn't turn out as great as you wanted to at the, don't tell a story that dangles and you're like, oh, and then it went to shit. And then what, like, uh, make sure that you still, like, if you need to snip the end off and like sort of do the, and then for various reasons we moved on, we took it to this point and we did these techniques and this was interesting and then it failed. Make sure you close it out so that even if it's a little side project that happened for a little while and for various reasons was put aside, keep in mind that you need to be storytelling with that too. Understand exactly why you want to bring that up, and you have to craft the narrative so that that's a concise story. You're going to convey the message that you want to convey there, and that at the end, you tie it off. Nobody likes a story that doesn't have an ending, right? And so you don't want to ramble and wander off lost at the end. You tell the story. We applied these techniques, and this is, the value I can convey to you from this story, and then make sure you have a closing there, so that you can, sort of move the conversation forward fluidly.
Thank you.
So you guys have been talking about like skill sets, and I imagine also since you're in different disciplines, you've kind of acquired different skills that are specific to that discipline, but some of them are just kind of general skills. Maybe it's comfort designing an experiment or processing data or stuff like that. And I wonder, I'm kind of starting my PhD now, and so in your position, are there like certain skills you acquired during your PhD, maybe they're specific to your discipline or just general, that now you're like, oh, I use these on a regular basis, and like, thank God I did this in my PhD because it's so useful now?
So this is going to depend heavily on the type of track that you go to. If you go into industry and you're starting with, and you have a PhD or an advanced degree, you can either go a technical primary contributor type route where you continue to turn the knobs and do the technical work, or you can end up on sort of the management business development type track. I sort of straddle the two, but I'm a chemist by training, and I work at Analog Devices, which is a hardcore electrical engineering company. So I can't do the technical job as well as anyone on my team, but yet I'm in like the management track above it. So like the key skills that I bring to the table is I have a strong bullshit detector, and I have a knack for seeing the value in what people are doing and trying to articulate the value and asking the key questions to make sure that we're de-risking the process and unlocking as much value and seeing the impact of what it is that's one little research project and what's the impact that could have larger. So it comes back, like I've said it a bunch of times, it's about understanding the context. And when you see some results, you can understand the technical pitfalls on the other sides, on either side, and yet what's the potential impact and what do we need to do to de-risk that to get from there. So that's really, I am probably the least technical on the panel here, but that has been the key to my success in my trajectory. And I will say along the way, there have been numerous times along this trajectory. I told that story where I've gone to everything from the community college to startups to nonprofits, now at a Fortune 500 company, and I have a director title. At every single one of those jobs, there are various times when I've been scared shitless and had all sorts of anxiety about where I'm going there, what's going to happen, etc. And sticking through it. That's an amazing skill learning through your PhD program. Not getting discouraged when things get hard, and that you may get to a point where you don't see the path forward, but the path forward is going to come through sort of your faith and your ability to persevere through this and to understand the problem and to take what at times seems sort of like intractable and try to understand what are the salient points, what are the key determining factors, how can I start minimizing risk, eliminating variables and focus on the places where I can make incremental progress to push the project forward. So I think that's absolutely a theme from grad school on, is that perseverance through.
Yeah, I'm still in a technical role, so I'll dwell on that for a second. But I think this is probably the case for many people. The work that you do when you first start out is probably going to be very different from what your thesis research was. And so maybe there's some transferable skills there. In my case, I'm still in the imaging domain. So a lot of like image processing and signal processing skills transferred over very well in that case. But then if you're in that domain shift, then really knowing like how to teach yourself a new subject quickly becomes a very valuable skill, and I think that's something you develop during a PhD. And also maybe just another note on that: if you're working anything AI related, is changing so fast. Just maybe to give one example that's secondhand, I had a friend. He graduated Brown BME. He has worked at Amazon in two different roles now. One, he started about a year ago, got laid off 9 months later, re-interviewed, went through the interview process again, completely different. Everything they wanted to know was generative AI, which was not at all on the horizon during the interview process the first time he went through. So that's just one thing to keep in mind, like that can change very quickly. But maybe to focus more on the soft skills for a second, I think that's a very important part of the PhD training too. Knowing how to ask the right questions, distill complex topics down into the simplest form is very useful to know. Having a good bullshit detector, it's great, it's fantastic. Really being able to just teach yourself quickly, ask the right questions, distill, identify risks and how to de-risk, I think is probably the most useful skills, whether you're in a technical role or later in your career too.
All right, I'll hit on some of the skills. Statistics. I would say those are the skills that transfer across all management and technical. The design of experiments, root cause analysis, how to approach a problem, all of those data analysis, data analytics, using different tools. I think it's a good skill generally for everyone. And it applies to management because we often review protocols and often review some reports, and we need to be able to to see whether the data is real or not. So I think that's one of the skills that I applied for the past 10 years pretty much daily. The other one, I was lucky enough that during my PhD, I got various skills. I can solving a problem analytically via simulation or via experiment. So be able to be multiverse and be able to approach a problem with the cheapest, most efficient way is a really good skill. So for example, at work, if we have a problem, sometimes people jump straight to like building this very crazy expensive experimental setup where it could be just like a calculation on a napkin saying very quickly, no, if you apply this force, it's going to break. Let's do something else. Or sometimes it could be SolidWorks simulation, again, very quick. So I think that's another skill I would say, just being able to find a way to solve a problem the most efficient way is really important. But then hard skills, especially if you're in science, knowing SolidWorks is great. So if you have an opportunity, sometimes you don't, but you don't get free software as you get at Brown. Once you leave Brown, that's it. There's no free software. So you have access to MATLAB, to Python, to SolidWorks, to ANSYS, to Abacus. Learn as much as you can, because once you get out of here, that's it. Like, especially if you don't work for a big company, if it's a startup, you won't be able to explore during your work. You need to, like, any skill is a good skill, any hard skill is a good skill, and obviously soft skills too. And then one thing I do want to also bring up, it's not skills related, but honesty and ethics is another thing. You need to learn research ethics throughout your PhD, because at work you have no freedom for any misunderstanding of ethics. Like, anything that we do wrong affects patient safety. So that's research ethics, and I think it's your first year of PhD. Once you proceed, you will you'll learn about this more, how important it is to be very honest about your data.
Thank you.
One skill that differentiated me in my interview was machining skills. So machine shop here, if you get a chance to take a machine shop class, that's another thing that differentiates you, because then you can prototype your own whatever you want.
Hi, I'm very curious about one thing about R&D industry. Since the projects are very time sensitive, how do you evaluate when your project is going to be stopped or pushing forward, and how do you communicate that with your boss?
It's a very good question, and usually, most likely, it's not a decision of one person. Um, so there are many projects. Most companies, it depends actually on the company. Some companies have much bigger investments into research, where most of the research is continued much longer, and they have a very liberal filter on when to cancel the project. But some companies have much smaller investment into research. So that means that for you to figure out a solution to your problem is much quicker. Like you get 3 months to solve this. If you don't get somewhere, this is it. So usually the success metrics for each project are defined at the early stage. So you kind of will know the health of a project throughout the way. When you, for example, if you did get 3 months and only 20K to solve a problem, you will be able to assess on the way whether it's approaching the success metric or if you're going to have to cancel it. And never call anything a failure. It's just that's it. You learned, you evaluated, you got 3 months, it didn't work, you're moving on to something else, and you will use those learnings somewhere else. I promise you, like every year something comes up and you're like, oh, I remember 5 years ago I used this and this is what happened. Let's pull it back in because we can save 3 months now because we already learned something from those 3 months that did not work. So yeah, most likely this will not be a decision that you'll have to do alone. It will be defined success metric by the company, and then you will evaluate it with your team.
Yeah, I might not be the best place to answer this question because I've been in my current role for just over a year. When I came in, all the milestones and decision gates were already defined for us, and that came from higher ups within Philips, but also our project was externally funded, and so that was defined during the grant process as well. What would be included in each phase of the project. I think as far as like what should be included at each milestone, um, that I think started like working backwards from talking to key stakeholders. So in our case, developing an ultrasound product, that would be the clinical stakeholders on the ground, which is the hospital systems, the sonographers, everyone else we'd be working with in the hospital and clinic setting. That could be regulatory agencies and healthcare agencies as well in the given country. And then working backwards from that, defining what are the key features that are required for like a minimum viable successful product, and then what are the timelines that are necessary to deliver on those minimum necessary features.
Yeah, so I think it's rightly pointed out that all the research projects in industry, it's on a much more condensed time frame, but you still have to go through the process in a sense. So in my experience, well, you have to come up with, you have to define what your success is, right? This is my target, and you need to create the project plan to reach that target. And all along the way, you need to define like what are the risks at each step, and what are the key metrics I'm going to use to judge success or not along the way. So it should be, as someone who's in the trenches doing it, as you're going through, you're gonna get a feeling where you're like, oh, this is or isn't working. Like you're gonna have a lot of time to watch that trajectory build up. And you're like, this is our next key reporting metric is going to be on this, and are you going to make it or are you not? But coming up with a good project plan and defining the metrics for success, that's something that it's really that's critical, and that's something that you'll probably be, like they said, is going to be part of a bigger team. This goes again where it's not just your project, because you're going to hand it off to the next phase of commercialization, and even those project plans sort of explode when you go from like initial evaluation, and I have a really simple set of KPIs or key performance indicators, and then you take it to the next rung of complexity and they say, oh, we're going to implement this in one of our customer systems, and then the requirements come like from 3 or 4 different groups, and they're like, oh yes, and what about this and these, and your complexity of implementation goes way up. But that's where, again, you say, well, I'm going to focus on my KPIs and make sure that I document the things to hand it off. But having a good project plan and defining those KPIs, that's how you're going to communicate whether or not you should kill it or it should keep going. Over the first year of my job, I came into a project that had a legacy to it. It had been around for a year or two, and it was kind of floundering. And it took me a couple months to have the confidence to say, what the hell are our benchmarks that we're measuring here against? And this is a very big, prestigious company, and we're in the advanced technology group, and they did not have appropriate benchmarks that they were measuring against. And one of the first things I did is I essentially killed a project and said, I don't want to see a single data point or like another PowerPoint on this technique until you have a relevant benchmark until that you can show me so that we can measure success. Because otherwise you show me some points and yeah, it's correlated to something, but to what, like, what's the benchmark? We then subsequently in that process, in sort of exploration with some of the team members, one of the team members came up and was like, oh, well, here's an interesting metric that we could track that seems important. We defined that metric. We came up with clear metrics. We came up with a test rig, or what you call it, the ghosts or whatever, your phantom. Like, we came up with a known metric. Okay, let's calibrate this. We went through a couple customer trials, all in the span of about 9 months. And so it took a year for me to kill one project, and then in 9 months we went from, and that project had been around for 2 years before I showed up, so 3-4 years of work there, to within 1 year we developed a concept, validated in the lab, built a prototype, and we went through 2 customer pilots in 9 months. And we still killed the project at the end because there was some of the complexities of the commercial landscape there, where it required implementing this within a different part of sort of the commercial system, where we didn't have direct access to the key partners and sort of market access there. So that was, I'll be honest, that one was really painful for me. That was like my first project that, like, I helped ideate it, we started it, and we took it through customer trials. The customers actually still really like it. They still bring it up. And I'm like, ooh, and we killed it. But this is where the company made a resource allocation and said, well, we have some really exciting projects that are like an order of magnitude more valuable to the company, that we had to move on to focus our efforts on those. So sometimes it's, outside of your choice. Do I have a little tear shed every time some big customer mentions that? It's like, yeah, we can't do it. I actually had to be the one to tell the customers and our sales team, like, we're not doing that anymore. Those were difficult emails to peck out.
Yeah, thank you. I do have one question because some of the audience might be the master degree students. So, do you think it's possible to go into R&D after, or grow in R&D with master degree or a PhD is necessary?
Nothing is necessary. Just your wild curiosity and ambition and motivation. I don't think there's some highly technical stuff where, again, it's as you pointed out, like, learn hard skills, right? All you need is, work ethic and a library card, right? To go and learn nearly anything. This is not a bad environment where you can learn from all sorts of great mentors, like your faculty and the staff here. And that's really the most valuable thing that you're gaining at an institution like this, is this access to an incredible network. And I'd say that's also what you're going to gain at the companies, is that when I went to college, I went to a small engineering school, and when all of a sudden everybody around me also liked to build stuff and, like, was interested in science. So, like, oh yeah, now I'm at Analog Devices. Oh my, the number of mentors and technical sort of leaders that I can interact with and ask questions to is really amazing. And we hire people. We have a whole program for new college grads that is explicitly easier for us to hire people who are bachelor's degree people, whereas we have other roles where we think that we need someone who has the technical chops to be able to dive in and do research right away. So there are some job roles that you're not going to be qualified for unless you have a PhD or master's, and that's like you'll have to prove it otherwise if you think you're a really strong candidate there. But if you want to get into a technical company, you don't need those skills. And part of that also goes back to we talked a bit about what if my work isn't going to be exactly my thesis? You just have to have sort of ferocious curiosity, and it doesn't matter. I'll attack a new project, and that's okay, right? So I would say no, it's not necessary.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And maybe I'll just add two things. I think even if you are a PhD, the learning process never ends, especially with the rate at which technology is changing. So everyone is always trying to keep their skills fresh. And there's ways to do that, both informally and formally, whether it's through online certifications or just watching 3 Blue 1 Brown on YouTube, whatever it might be. Just keep up with how things are changing. You'll find resources to do that at a company too, like for example, journal clubs where you review the latest literature and talk about it with your teammates. That can be very helpful. And then just the other thing I would add, if you're a master's student and you're concerned about finding your fit in a role, there are programs out there where they put you through several rotations. For example, I know J&J does this, BD does this, and they generally title them something like Technology Leadership Development Program or something like that. And that will give you an opportunity to get that hands-on experience in a structured format to prepare you for that career path. If that's something that you're interested in.
Yeah, I don't think you need PhD, but actually, it depends on what role you're applying for. In some cases, like biology, for example, sometimes you're not exposed to advanced techniques unless you get a PhD or unless you get an advanced degree. So that would be unique cases where you're doing very difficult research or preclinical trials for some company. You do need to be exposed to some advanced techniques. But again, I worked for a consulting company where I was building their research and development team, and most of the people who we were hiring were promoted internally, and they didn't have advanced degree. It was mostly about their personality and their creative thinking, and they're not scared to get their hands dirty, and they're very committed to the success of the company. They have this team player personality, and usually that's what helps more than sometimes an advanced degree. So I think it depends where you're applying and what you're trying to accomplish. But again, there is no hard rules. R&D can be anything. It's more about creative thinking and problem solving.
So we have that rotation program too. It's only for new college grads, and that's part of that sort of pool of hiring undergrads. And to the point on the so we had one guy who came in as a bachelor's degree in the lab as a lab technician, and he sets up the experiments, and he's physically physically assembling the test fixtures and then programming little scripts on these battery cyclers. And he was just living in the lab, just being a lab jockey, cranking away, always doing those test fixtures. And as I talked to him, I was like, hey, what percentage of your week are you spending at your desk? So he's in the lab, and there's a desk in the lab, but he actually had a cubicle. It happens to be right outside the senior VP's office. Everyone's you realize that you have a prime seat if you want to be, for career ambition, if you want to get to know leaders at the company, and I was like, how many hours a week are you spending at your desk doing any personal development stuff? He was implementing experiments for one of the senior people. One of these guys who actually was senior enough where he had no direct reports, and he was working on this really interesting project. And he was implementing the experiments, and I was like, oh, that's a great mentor for you to sort of lean into that relationship, ask him lots of questions and stuff. And he's using this modeling software. The senior guy was using this modeling software. It's like, hey, have you opened up that modeling software, and have you mimicked the model that he's doing yet? Just literally copy and paste the model that he's using to start fudging the numbers and stuff. And he was hesitant at first, really kind of a little nervous to get out of his shell. lo and behold, a couple months later, and he's done that, and like he has gone up the curve so fast. And so, as a bachelor's degree person, now doing, the impact that he's making and the positive reviews that he's getting from the rest of the team, really excelling. It's like yes, that's the so it absolutely it's about the attitude and the approach that you take and leaning into those relationships and the opportunities to continue to learn. If you show up and you say, "This is my job description," and if you ask me to do something that's not in my job description, I'm not going to do it, you're not going anywhere, right? And you're going to stay right there at best. Whereas if you excel and you strive to do more, and you don't, not to be like aggressively ambitious, but if you also, like, if someone asks you a question, if you take the time to help them, you follow through with what you say that you're going to do, and you document what you do, and you show yourself to be excellent, and you're outgoing, and you're not hesitant to take on more, that really shows, and that's what gets the attention of management. And it's not that you want to keep taking on more and such that you can't make deadlines. You need to be honest and upfront and transparent. Uh, and you don't want to do it and be walked all over and not get acknowledgement for the work that you do. But that goes to having open and honest conversations with your managers where there's periodic reviews with management. You say, so, how's the year going? What were your goals for the year? How are we tracking on those? And if you sort of document the work that you're doing and the progress that you're making, and you sort of are upfront about that, that's that's really important. That sort of self advocacy on top of that attitude. That really, there's a difference between people who will move up the ladder very quickly and progress, and those who are okay being right where they are. I've had the situation with two direct reports. One is very soft spoken, incredibly humble, and absolutely brilliant. And he does an incredible work ethic, documents things incredibly. He's like just star player, great, like best team player I have on the whole team. And I have somebody else who is more ambitious, complains more about wanting more responsibility, doesn't document things as well, and doesn't follow through as well as the other guy does. But yet he squeaks more and he wants to move up, and the other guy. And if you look at the compensation, this is sort of the compensation structure that I inherited. And you know who gets paid more? The squeaky one, because they pushed hard. And so that's something that's at the same time, he's bumped up to the top of where he's going to go because he doesn't execute on those other sides. Where the soft-spoken one, I've been trying to encourage, like, hey, you're doing great, and if you look to make transitions, like if you're mindful with what you do, you could grow further. Honestly, for him, I don't think he wants to go any further, and he's happy where he is. There's a concept of the Peter principle. I don't know if you guys have heard of this. In some ways, it can be painted in a negative light, where people say you get promoted to your level of incompetence. That's one interpretation of it. But if you actually listen to the sort of founder of the principle describe it, the essence is that you should don't necessarily jump at every promotion if it's not what you actually want to do, right? So this gentleman is very happy to be a star individual contributor, and he maybe mentors some people, but he doesn't want to deal with a bunch of bureaucratic management BS, and so he's really happy with where he is. And so he's on an individual contributor. It may limit some of the growth opportunity, but he really likes what it is he does, right? So that's something to be cognizant of, and that's something to remind yourself as well when you're at a company. If you start in a technical R&D role, where do you want to go with that, right? What is your long-term trajectory? Look around at your company and other companies, and look at the people that you know in your life, and say, well, who do I want to be like? Like who's got a job that I actually like? When I left my postdoc and went to work at the Bronx Community College, I did not think that I wanted to be a Bronx Community College faculty or staff. But I knew that I wanted to get some management experience. I knew I wanted to have some direct impact, and I knew I wanted to learn about sustainable energy. And so for me, that was an opportunity where I knew exactly what I wanted to get out of that role. And I went and I got at various things I intended to, and also things that I didn't seek out initially, but yet the opportunities presented themselves. And at each step of my career, I've been mindful about, well, what's the role that I want to have, and is there a step in between where I am now and where I need to be to get where I want to be? So that's something else to think about, right? Where if that's the job I want, is there some other, what's the job or two jobs in between where I am now and where it is I want to be? Being very mindful about what activities do I need to do and what skills do I need to pick up to get there. I mean, in theory, back in high school, you were all so intentional. You were like, I need to go and get a PhD in an advanced science field because I want my life mission to be something, right? You were all totally mindful of that when you were 17 or something, right? Totally. But it's that, there's a certain amount of serendipity that happens. But if you could start to be mindful and like intentional with how you align your opportunities and where you spend your time, the places where you network and the people that you bump into, you can make luck, right? Luck is the combination of preparedness meets opportunity. And so if you spend your time preparing yourself and putting yourself in the right situations where the opportunities will present themselves, that'll do wonders.
I think I've already addressed the current question, but could I maybe ask a question of my co-panelists?
Sure.
So you brought up compensation briefly, and my experience going through the process was I underestimated based on what my final offer was, what a fair compensation would be. So how do the two of you determine what would be a fair, benefits and compensation when you're, asking for a raise or going through the job interview process?
All right. So it's not the same for me as it may be for you guys because I was an international student. So my choices were not as wide and were very narrow, and negotiating salary was not as easy as an international student because you have a lot of you worry about your visa, you worry about this. There's other things you try to negotiate. Your salary may not be the thing that you think about. So my first job that I got, I did not negotiate salary at all. And I can tell you for sure I was underpaid compared to other people. I mean, we all talk when we graduate and we talk about our offers and stuff. But as I was progressing through my career, the way I would negotiate later on when I got smarter and clever and understood what this means and wasn't as shy and knew that I'm bringing a lot more to the table than I was thinking initially, I would look at Glassdoor. I would look at all the statistics out there. I mean, the data supporting your argument is the best thing you can offer. So I had my homework done. I went to Glassdoor. I looked at the average salaries for R&D engineer with so many years of experience in this field, and that's what I would bring to the table with me. But then again, it's an average salary. Do you consider yourself an average employee? Perhaps not. Perhaps you perform better. And you would know that because every year you would get annual reviews and you would either perform average, exceptional, etc., etc. So now you have additional data set. You're saying, all right, this is my average salary plus I know I'm an exceptional employee. That means I need to be making above this because I'm not an average employee. So I think in my experience, I'm not as bold in negotiating. And again, that comes with all other inclusivity and everything else, but that's the skill, that's the process that I used.
Yeah, one thing that's good to note, we were talking about job talks and stuff before. Essentially, never ask about salary or anything like that when you're in the interview process. If you get to the point where they're offering you a job and you have a conversation, you'll likely get handed off with HR, where they will talk about that sort of stuff. You do not talk about compensation until they give you the offer, and then you can have a more polite and tactful conversation with HR there, right? If you're talking to the technical manager there and you're focused on that, that's just like that's don't do that. Yeah, it's tacky. It's showing you're focused on the wrong. When you talk to the technical people, you're talking about bringing value to the team and that you're going to be a really valuable team member, and you're focused on what it is you can do for them, right? And then ways that you can frame it is it's maybe easier in discussions if you're going up for an annual review where it's a little bit more awkward when you're talking to HR, but you can ask about ranges. And you say, well, what's that? Can you describe the job title? What's the job rank that I'm coming in here? When you go to Glassdoor, there's like engineer 1, 2, 3, 4. And like, can you tell me a little bit about their ranges? Like, what's the, what's the range that I should expect to come in here? And oftentimes HR will tell you what's not reasonable to negotiate. Or they may say, it's like, well, you're already at the top of the rate. Like this job requisition is approved at this level. And for you to come in at this level, then you should expect to come in here. They do not want to hire you at the top of the range for that job level because it means you have no place to go until they give you a full promotion to another job level. And so you don't want to come in and be at the bottom of the range. You should be targeting to come in at the mid-level of the range. And then that gives you your line of sight to say, okay, if there's a $20,000 or $40,000 bracket that this job title's in, well, if it's going to take me 2 years to get a promotion or 3 years to get this is where I want to see my salary move within that range over time, right? And then the other aspect is in that, so you may have less flexibility on the salary, but you want to know where you are in the range. But there may be other things that you could negotiate easier. So in our company, there's annual bonuses that like cash bonuses based on corporate performance. And then there's RSUs or like sort of stock that they give you that's based on personal performance. And so that's something where if you get a signing bonus, like, you may be able to negotiate a signing bonus or get some extra stock options as a signing add-on. Another thing I asked about, I was living one town west of Worcester before, and I would have to commute into Boston, and I asked about a relocation because I was thinking I was going to have to move my family to get within commuting distance, where it really wasn't. It would have been pretty tough to commute in from Boston from where I was. Not impossible, but not pleasant. And it turns out I was 51 miles from the office, and the threshold was 50 miles for the relocation bonus. And so it turned out to be a very valuable thing for me to have asked about. And that was just something that they could give, where on the salary side, it was an option. Another thing, this is like a luxury to have, right? But when I had, with the job I was at, I was at a startup, and there was like some equity, there was more equity on the table at the startup. And I could say, well, where I am, this is good, but I'm walking away from X. Like, how can you help me square this? I really want to come to the company, but I feel like I'm doing myself a disservice if I'm walking away from something else. How can you help me feel better about this? And that was a powerful thing. We're like, okay, well, we'll bump up a little bit of the, what we could offer you here because you had something else. That's a situation where you have sort of like something that you can negotiate against. And I realize that you probably don't feel if you're just doing job applications, you're not going to feel that way right away that you have anything to negotiate against. So, but just something to keep in mind. You can't make like a hollow threat. I had one guy who interviewed for a job. He was far and away the best candidate, and he was at all the right companies before and had the right role that we wanted him. I was like, I bent over backwards to get this guy a job offer, top of this pay scale, all this stuff that was like a huge pain in the butt. And he kept negotiating. And then the son of a gun, he was using us to play us against his current employer. I was pissed. We went through all this work to get him the job offer at the max and all this stuff. And he ended up staying with his employer after we were doing all this whole process. And you know what? 6 months later, you know who reaches back out to me asking if we have any other offers? You can guess what I did with that email. So, anyways, that's yeah. So be careful, don't push too hard.
I would second that. So, at least medical device field, the world, the market is very small and people know each other. So don't be too aggressive, because eventually the circle will complete itself and you will get to, like, I honestly, like, 10 years later, I'm now running into people I work with that I worked like 10 years ago. So like it's a very small market, and you'll be seeing the same people over and over again over your career.
Something to think about too. So there may be job postings that you see and you're like, crap, I am overqualified for that job posting, but that's the job I want. And like you, how do I get into that company? They're hiring a master's or bachelor's level. Like, you could potentially come in and say, it's like, if you don't negotiate, don't bust their chops over negotiating up front, right? But you say, I want to come in and, like, ideally, can we talk about, in a year or two, you could try to negotiate to say, like, I would like to go up for review in a year. Like, if I excel, like, I'm not gonna negotiate hard. I understand on the budget for this role right now, you have this approved, but can we schedule a review where we reevaluate what my contributions are in this role, and if it would justify moving it up to a higher pay bracket. So if you feel like you're sort of limited by the pay bracket of the job role, I remember that happened a lot when I was looking at job postings right out of my PhD, and I was like, oh, like all these lower level roles. And when I see it, when I'm looking at, you look at job candidates, and you're like, well, this guy's got a PhD, but we only, he's never going to take this job offer because it's way lower than what they would get paid otherwise. But that sort of flexibility or creativity is a way, one thing to think about if you don't have financial obligations in the short term before mortgages and kids and whatever that stuff. So.
Well, thank you so much for those helpful advices and sharings. Let's thank for the panelists again. So now I guess we are moving to the third part where you can talk to the panelists, Freddie, individually. So thank you for coming.